So first, though, to get a number on the table, can you put a number on just how impactful genes are on behavior or psychological differences among individuals?
Yeah. Well, there's this famous paper by Plomin in 2015 that reviewed, uh, what was it? Something like, it's about twin studies, which compares identical and non-identical twins. And it reviews something like 4,500 studies over just all the studies that have been done, and puts them together in a meta-analysis for hundreds of characteristics, medical, physiological. But if you just summarize it, on average, physical traits like height, weight, people might be especially interested to find. Physical traits are about 70% heritable. And I'll explain what
Oh,
that means.
Robert, this is
Yeah.
a okay. Okay, yeah, this was because you and I talked about this beforehand. Just so our listeners have an understanding of heritability as a percentage. When you say that something is 25% or 70% heritable, what does that mean?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, the 6-syllable word heritability is probably the most misunderstood word in biology, but so it's great that you bring this up. By heritable, we're talking about individual differences. So people get it when you say, is eye color heritable? And, they say, yeah, sure. And they sort of understand what you mean. Some people have brown eyes and some people have blue eyes, and they see that runs in families. And they also see it's not a single gene thing, because you see lots of variations within families. So heritability is the extent to which it's just a statistic that describes the extent to which inherited DNA differences can account for differences in behavior. So people kind of recognize, I assume, that, well, actually, I've done surveys on this. I know people understand that if you ask, how heritable do you think height is? From 0% to 100%. On average, people will come up with a pretty good estimate of, say, 80, 90%. And that is what it is. And what that means is that in the populations we study, people differ in height. 90% of those differences are due to inherited DNA differences for height. And even more surprisingly to people is weight. Weight is 70% heritable. So, which surprises people because that's one trait where people think, well, it's got to be environmental, because, if you don't eat, you lose weight and all of that. But it misunderstands the basic point here, that we're describing differences that exist in a population and using methods like the twin method, the adoption method, and now DNA to ask the extent to which the differences we observe are due to inherited DNA differences. And by that, I mean, you start life as a single cell with half the DNA from your mother, half from your father. That DNA in that one cell is the same DNA in the trillions of cells in your body. So that's what we're talking about when we say heritable. And it's still that 1% that I mentioned before. The 1% of the DNA of the 3 billion base pairs that differs between us. We're saying that 1% of DNA that differs, and that's millions of steps, the 3 billion base pairs of DNA. So 1% is a lot of steps in the spiral staircase. It allows you to have a lot of DNA variation. Those DNA differences account for, say, 90% of the differences between us in height. So that's what heritability is. It's describing a particular population. There's a bunch of other caveats, I should say. We're talking about you can only talk about the samples you study. And so in psychology, we study pretty representative samples, maybe 95% of the population. But we're not studying, say, kids who grow up in abusive families, for example, because those people don't often participate in research. So it's pretty representative, but it is limited to the populations we study. So you can't generalize to other populations or to other cultures, for example. Getting back to this meta-analysis by Plomin in 2015 is amazing. It summarized something like 4,500 twin studies comparing identical and non-identical twins across all the life sciences. And just summarizing that data at the grossest level, physical traits like weight show about 70% heritability on average, meaning 70% of the differences between people in weight are due to inherited DNA differences. And for physiological traits, it's more like 60%. But the amazing thing is, for psychology, if you go across the hundreds of traits that have been studied, personality, psychopathology, cognitive traits, on average, the average heritability estimate is just about exactly 50%. And that means half of the differences between people are due to inherited DNA differences. It also means half of the differences between people are not due to inherited DNA differences. That's about the environment. But there's also a lot more it tells us about the environment. But it is dramatic, though, to think that we've gone from not considering genetics to realizing that genetics is far and away the most important systematic source of individual differences in psychology. It's off the scale of other psychological effects, and it's unusual in psychology to have effects that explain 5% of the variance. The variance is a statistic that describes the extent to which people differ. It sort of describes this normal bell-shaped curve. And so it is quite amazing to have gone from not even talking about genetics to realizing genetics is the most important systematic factor, which is why my book is called Blueprint: How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. And I should say that 50% I mentioned varies from, say, 40% for personality to maybe 60% for cognitive abilities. But 40%, 60%, it interests us who are in the field. But I mean, for most people, the thing is, it's a long way from 0%. Increasingly, it's important to emphasize it's a long way from 100% too. So it isn't all genetics.